So I would like to welcome everybody. My name is Nancy Morgan. I'm the coordinator of the Virginia chapter of American Promise. Today, we're really delighted. We have Luisa Boyarski here from the Grassroots Coalition. So we're going to be discussing the strategies for broadening grassroots mobilization in Virginia within the context of money and politics. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to everybody put their name, if you're linked to a specific organization, put it in the chat. And any questions that you have in the chat, we'll be monitoring. Jessica will be monitoring. I was worried. Okay, anyway, thanks everybody. We're talking about money and politics. We're going to do a brief overview of what happened this year in Virginia and nationally. And so just a comment on American Promise. What is American Promise? American Promise is unique in the democracy reform space. It's a cross-partisan nonprofit organization to empower citizens advocacy in all 50 states to pass a constitutional amendment. And in Virginia, we would be remiss if in our pay-to-play state, if we didn't also look at getting money out of politics in terms of campaign finance reform. And obviously, why? Well, we believe that we, the people, not money, super PACs, or corporations govern. So why should we care about money in politics? I think everybody out there can just say, they can put into the chat what is their entry point for money in politics? And the circle goes on and on. Virginia energy policies, broader issues of climate change here in Virginia with rising sea levels, et cetera, spiraling drug prices, dysfunctional healthcare system, mass incarceration of private prisons. And yes, GEO is still giving money both nationally and in Virginia to legislators to keep their federal prisons working. Nursing home care and regulations, broadband access. My entry point was poverty because I worked for the UN. And I was actually I worked for the UN for 20 years and then 7 years in Africa. So I'm concerned about poverty and things like the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit, critical programs to alleviate poverty, and they're not being funded. It's all about money and politics. So look at this. Boy, 2020 was a blowout year in terms of money and politics. Look at that, at $14 billion was spent on the election. And this was a combination, obviously, of the presidential and congressional races. It was incredible. You remember this, the democracy reform people who were down elections, people looking at Georgia, the 2 Senate elections were at least $500 billion each. South Carolina, North Carolina, Ohio, Greg Taylor, who's on the line, knows Iowa really well. Arizona, all of this added up. And when you look at more than 1 billion of this was dark money meaning from 50C4s where they don't report. You don't know where this money is coming from. And then you have the broader universe of independent expenditures, which is super PACs, which actually report, but they report to the Federal Elections Committee. So this was really a blowout year. So how did we get here? And it's always interesting to me, the contribution of Virginia to money and politics, because if we roll back the history and we're like in 1971 in Richmond, we would see a guy, who was he? Lewis Powell. And what was his message? Who was he and what was his message? Well, Lewis Powell was a lawyer. And at the time he was talking to the head of the Chamber of Commerce, who was also a Virginian. And he was nominated to the Supreme Court by President Nixon that year. And his message was business must acquire political power. And over the last 40 years, he was instrumental in starting the whole wave of Supreme Court rulings that basically gave corporations power in terms of money and speech and taking away our political voice. So these 40 years of court decisions, you have Buckley versus Vallejo, 1976. That was an interesting one. This was the first time ever election spending struck down as free speech. And interestingly enough for you guys, I didn't realize this, when you have people like Bloomberg or a lot of people in the Virginia House and Senate where they're self-financed, this is why we cannot put limits on spending. So a lot of legislators, when you talk to them, was saying, well, we should just curtail spending. But in fact, this is why we can't, because the Supreme Court has deemed it unconstitutional. So you had this 1977, National Bank versus Bilotti, and that was in Boston. Unlimited corporate spending and ballot initiatives. We're not a ballot initiative state, but ballot initiatives are critical in a lot of times in local elections and small elections, state elections. Of course, the infamous 2010 Citizens United, unlimited election spending by corporations and unions, and that's what's behind this this incredible trend in spending and money. 2011, ATP versus Bullock, as we know, was the governor of Montana. That was an interesting one because 25 states had campaign finance rules that had to be rescinded because of Citizens United. In the case of Montana, if you watch the movie Dark Money, that was 100 years of campaign finance law that was thrown out the door because of Citizens United. In 2014, McCutcheon versus the Federal Elections Committee, they put limits on total contributions were struck down. So there is a whole history, as in this graph, it says, thanks again to the Supreme Court, my free speech is worth more than yours. And when you look at Virginia, it's quite interesting. You see the same trend. And this is because of the federal issues and money coming into our election, but it's also because Virginia is one of only 5 states with no limitations on campaign contributions. And when you look at 2019, that was the House of Delegates, the Senate, $121 million, 25 million coming from out of state. This is a lot of us recognize District 40, which is, I'm not going to mention the delegates, but $4 million in aggregate for election for a position that pays less than $18,000. Now, don't you think that there's something wrong with that story? Anyway, it's obviously spending going out of control, and the Coalition for Integrity came out last October. Virginia rates 46th on the Swamp Index, which is an index of 50 across 50 states on ethics and transparency and disclosure. You can see in the table on the side, you have Virginia, followed by Utah, Michigan, Arizona, Idaho, and Wyoming. And part of that abysmal rating is because of our campaign finance and lacks of transparency and accountability to voters. So just a quick overview of the graveyard of campaign finance bill. Luisa and all you guys on the Grassroots Coalition have heard this, and even our members, we've been talking about this since the end of the General Assembly. The first 2 were in the Senate, and this is, I swear, every time I look at these 2 bills, I think of Groundhog's Day, because the movie Groundhog's Day, because nothing ever changes. It's just the same results. Anyway, it was a limitations bill by Chap Peterson. It died. Banning corporate contributions from public service corporations like Dominion died. Ibrahim Samira had a companion bill in the House and the subcommittee on campaign finance died. Banning corporate contributions. This was an interesting one. And all of these, we were due diligence. We were up there testifying. This is banning corporate contributions. 22 other states do it. The federal government has done it since 1907. It died. We testified, but the egregious thing was they didn't have a vote. So I think it's a little bit disrespectful when you have people testifying and there's no vote. It's sort of democracy dies in darkness. Of course, then there's the infamous Marcus Simon bill that was fine. We were trying to finally put on limits on campaign contributions, and passed the Senate or House 100-0, and then died in the House of Delegates. It sort of stumbled through the Privileges Elections Committee, got to the floor, was rewritten, and then on a voice vote, so you don't know what the vote was. And then I sent it back to the Privileges Elections Committee, which was finished for the year. So this is an example of something that we really need to work on and make our legislators know that this is not acceptable. The only thing that really passed was the subcommittee study, David Bulova, and which is, I guess they're meeting, the Joint Rules Committee is meeting next week to look at the scope of work. We're hoping that one of our members will be one of the 4 citizens membered to that. There is actually something good happened. We were trying to get Virginia to be the 22nd state to say we want constitutional amendment overturning Citizens United. Well, we got Mike Mullins to agree to introduce it in the House, and then Pray Deeds in the Senate, but we couldn't get through it in the Senate because they don't accept that type of a resolution. So we ended up with a hybrid resolution appreciating our efforts to overturn Citizens United. So our eulogy for the last General Assembly is in this cartoon. Man, I'm so bored, says the Grim Reaper. I've got an idea. Why don't we hang around the Senate and wait for some legislation to die? Well, anyway, so what is our group doing? Very quickly, legislative outreach, Wire, Beyer, and Conley there, because we want all of our congressional representation to vote, co-sign a resolution that has the resolution for a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United. Last General Assembly, we had 7 out of the 11 representatives and our 2 senators sign it. So our goal is to reach out and get each senator, even the Republicans. We're nonpartisan, so we really want to reach across the aisle. MoneyOut pledges, we've got Beyer and Conley to sign it. Input into this, what I said, the Bulova study. We're analyzing, providing them with guidance in terms of what's happening in other states, build awareness, letters to the editor, engaging with journalists, generating partnerships, which is why we're here today to look at how do you really expand grassroots mobilization in Virginia, with the objective of building our group across the state. So what can you do? Entry points for action. Next week, we're having our National Citizens Leadership Conference. And so it would be great. I'll put, Jessica, if you could put the link up in the chat, that would be great. Setting up meetings with all of our legislators, both in the Senate and the House. You're welcome to join us. If you can't join us, put your thoughts into a constituent letter. We'll use it for lobbying. Sign our citizens pledge, sign a petition, come to our weekly MoneyOut meetings. And also, one thing that we're really looking at this year is just passing local resolutions, recognizing in the Senate it's going to be difficult to get campaign finance through. Let's have Alexandria signed it, Arlington, Falls Church, Charlottesville in 2013. Let's get some of our other local communities to sign resolutions asking that legislators support getting big money out of politics. So we need to work together, and that's why Lisa is here and why I'm going to turn this across to Zaina. But please join us to ratify this constitutional amendment that we're hoping by July 4th, 2026 will actually be in the process of being ratified. Let's have Virginia be the first state to ratify this. We were the 38th for the ERA. Let's make it us #1 and then help us pass campaign finance and ethics reform. We really need your help. So I'm just going to turn it over to Zaina to introduce Luisa. So thank you very much, and Zaina.
Thank you so much, Nancy. It's such an honor to be here and to be co-facilitating this. My name is Zaina. I am a member of American Promise Virginia, and I'm an active member here in the Grassroots in Virginia and various different organizations. But it's truly an honor to be introducing someone who is an inspiration to many of us in the Grassroots, who I was really lucky to work with on a different project. But I'm so honored that you're here with us. Dr. Luisa Boyarski is the Associate Director of the Center for Public and Nonprofit Leadership. She's involved in developing and executing the center's many executive education and customized programs and representing the center at Georgetown University and in the broader community. She currently leads the Grassroots Coalition, a group of grassroots organizations in Virginia representing over 10,000 citizens. Dr. Boyarski received her PhD in comparative government from Georgetown University, with research focused on the role of nonprofit coalitions in public policy and advocacy. Thank you so much for being here. It's so wonderful to have you, Dr. Luisa. And I'm just going to start the conversation with something, vast, but also very specific to your experience in the Grassroots Coalition. Do you mind telling us a little bit about some of the successes and challenges over the years of actually building and maintaining a successful grassroots organization with objectives and, actual conclusions and results that you see for your work? Thank you again for joining us.
Yes, absolutely. It's so great to be here with everyone. And I'm going to try to keep my responses short so that we can also have a fair amount of time to discuss. I think a lot of it is there's the theory and then there's really the practice and trying to figure out how do we take, even if it's examples of successes and challenges from another organization, to then think about ourselves and what we can do to advance our own work. So the Grassroots Coalition started in April of 2017. And the main reason for the coalition coming together was that there were all of these new grassroots groups that wanted to see change happen. And a lot of them were relatively small and had relatively little power. And I think it was very clear to these new activist volunteers that none of these groups on their own were really going to be able to do the work and get the results individually. They didn't say it that way, but that's sort of, I think they all knew that. Yeah. And so there was this pressure that said, look, guys, we need you to start working together. You need to get into a room and you need to decide, like, how are we going to go about doing this? And I think the biggest thing that was successful early for the coalition was that we had one goal. And so we asked everyone to come together to do one thing, and that was to elect Democrats to the House of Delegates in Virginia. We wanted to flip as many seats as we could. And by having that very singular focus, it helped bring people together in a way that meant we didn't have to discuss some of the thorny issues of, like, how do you feel about the, addressing climate change? What, how far do you think we need to go on women's reproductive rights? How are we going to tackle immigration reform, right? So instead of having, getting into the issues, which is the work that you guys are doing, we started with elections. And I think it just, by having that one focus, whether it's elections or it's a particular issue ask, helps organizations come together and say, look, we don't have to agree on everything. We just need to agree that this thing that we're doing together is our goal. So I think that was very important for the early success of the coalition. But it's really hard. There's a challenge that we have to, a balance that we have to strike within the coalition between how much autonomy does every organization who's in the coalition have versus how aligned do we need to be to get the work done. And over time, our alignment has had to increase because we've started to do legislative work. So no longer is it okay just to say, oh, well, we're just going to support Democrats. Now it's like, how are we going to work together and what are our priorities going to be? And that requires people building trust with each other. That requires, some people choosing, okay, even though this isn't my top priority, I'm okay working on that as long as we can also work on this other thing as well, right? And so sharing the burden of the work, even if it's work that's not your personal issue, right? The thing that you're personally driven by. It's also, we've had to struggle with how formal or informal is this coalition structure. I'm part of a call with other state coalitions like ours, and we all have sort of landed on this similarly, like, not very structured structure because it's hard when you're asking people who already are running their own, grassroots group to then be like, oh, can you also be part of a leadership team for this coalition? We just don't have that much free time, right? I mean, some of us are, some people are retired and maybe have a little more free time than others, but for the most part, we don't want this to be our full-time job. Or it just doesn't financially work that way, right? And so we had to be really thoughtful about how do we involve everybody, but without too much hierarchy. So there's really a balance there as well. And then, some of this comes out in some of the research I've done, but really finding, like, what is our lane? What is our relationship with the broader movement? And, one of the areas that this came up relatively early on and comes up frequently is, we are a coalition and most of us are white people. And what is our role in, diversity, equity, racial justice? And there definitely people have come up to me and said, well, Luisa, we need to get more people of color at our meetings. And my response is, no, we don't. We need to go to their meetings. It is not their job to come to us. It is not their job to sign on to our agenda. It is our job to reach out and to understand what they're doing and where they could use support or added power to the work that they're doing, right? And so I think, you know, those are some of the things that we grapple with within the coalition all the time. And I think the most important part, though, is we are so lucky to be in a space where, for the most part, there aren't tons of checks and balances, right? There's not anybody who's looking over our shoulder being like, well, did you do the thing that you promised you were going to do? We have a lot of leeway to try new things and to be creative and to take risks. And I consistently try to push us to do that. We aren't legislators who have constituents we have to respond to. We're not, you know, getting huge grants because we don't have an entity to even accept money, right? So are we holding our own selves accountable to being as forward thinking and to being as risk taking as we can be?
So, Luisa, this is Nancy, and it's interesting from your research you've done. You've sort of analyzed what's happened since 2017, and there have been so many changes. And it started off being the election issues, and then the legislative issues have come in, and there seems to be this play between the two. And could you give us a little bit about your thoughts on talking about the issue groups and how the Grassroots Coalition engages with them? And how have you found over the time period, have there been linkages built with between different groups? Because that's one of the challenges of broadening our Grassroots Coalition, is exactly what you say, is identifying those groups and having us go to their meetings and finding that synergy. But I must say, it's very challenging.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of the, you know, play between elections and legislation, you know, part of the research that I did in 2019 was to ask the question, well, how are we going to keep this movement moving after 2020? If we are lucky enough to get a Democrat elected as president, aren't most people going to be like, work here is done, right? We got the people into office, and then we also flipped the state Senate and House that year, right? So we were really done. You know, Virginia was blue, you know, all of, you know, so there was a real question of how do we keep people engaged? And the solution to me was issues, right? If we get people to care enough about particular issues that they want to see advanced, we've already done some of the work to build the power and relationships we need to influence the legislators because we got them elected, right? We did all that upfront work. We should be here to like make sure that we're holding them accountable to the things that we want we want to see changed in Virginia. So I think the fact that the coalition transitioned to starting to do legislative work in 2020 after we flipped the House and Senate was really, really critical to keeping people involved and to really caring about what was going on throughout the year. That also created this great opportunity for us to engage issue groups, because our people, that wasn't their strength, right? We were really good at elections, and some of the people in the group, in the coalition, had particular issues they were interested in. But what really brought new groups together was us putting together this legislative priorities letter. And we put that together and send it out to our legislators before the session starts. And just having the opportunity to get different groups to input, these are the most important things that we need to be focusing on for this session, was really important. And what it also did was, I was a little worried that certain groups would come back and be like, well, why did you put this bill? And how about that bill? And what ended up happening was most of them said, hey, you put one bill we cared about, fantastic. We'll put our name to all those other bills because I'm sure they're good, right? So there was just a lot less I just thought there would have been more nitpicking, and I think where we had gotten was that people realized that in order to get progressive legislation passed, we have to focus on raising all boats, not just raising our own. And so I think that's where this important relationship comes in between, the people doing issue work need to have some contact with the people doing electoral work, because there's some power there and there's some leverage there. But at the same time, the people doing the electoral work really need the issue people, because when we get down into a legislative session and there's questions about how legislation, what language is in a bill or where we have concerns, like, we need the experts at the table as well. So I think that that has sort of been an important growth for the coalition. In terms of, how do you build the partnerships, or how do you start to connect with, groups? I don't think there's like an easy solution to that, but it is, again, this needing to show up in other people's spaces. And so reaching out, I mean, Nancy, you have that great slide that says, these are all of the issues that campaign finance is important for. I would start showing up at those meetings and like listening to see what they have to say. I mean, there's, one of the places where we've seen a lot of really great collaboration is in the environmental space, and the work that Sharon has been doing with a number of the environmental groups. But it took her, a couple of years just to get invited to sit at that table, right? But then what she's tried to do is really help pull other groups who aren't part of things in when necessary. And I think that's the other thing that I've found is that if you show up at other people's spaces, how do you show that you're not just there to listen, but it's like, how can I help? Like, what do we need? Realizing that even these nonprofits, none of them are highly funded, right? So we're all pretty scrappy. How are we showing up and saying, okay, again, this may not be our top issue, but I have some contacts, or I have someone else who might be really great to bring in for X, Y, and Z. And so sometimes it's like, how are we helping advance somebody else's banner in a way that they start to see like, oh, they're here for us, and how can we show up for them? It's really just, I think it's that give and take, but sometimes it means we have to be the first ones to give, but I think that's part of it. And it's also just willing to be the people who are signing up for the working groups and signing up to do some of the heavier lifting. And then I know we're going to talk about this a little bit more, but it's also really, it all is fundamentally comes down to relationships, right? So like when you have new people come to your meetings, not just saying, oh, it was great to see that we had some new people. It's literally emailing them and saying, hey, can we have a Zoom coffee? I'd love to get to know more about you. Why, what makes you interested in this, right? It's by you figuring out what motivates each individual, not just what motivates people in general, but like everybody has their own thing. And sometimes it's, that they have a particular agenda they want to advance. Sometimes it's just a personal interest, but they would like, more resources or things like that. It's just, how do we keep engaging with those people just like we would if we were building a friendship, right? And getting to know them and spending more time with them. I mean, I remember Network Nova and Stare and her team showing up at our first coalition meeting, and they came up to me and they were like, Luisa, we have this great idea. We want to do a women's summit. And I'm just looking at them like, we just started and you want to do a summit in like 3 months, and none of us have legal entities, and this is going to be insane to do. And like, instead of saying that, I looked at them and I said, that is such a fantastic idea. I'm so glad you guys want to do that. Go for it. Let me know how I can help, right? And so I think some of it is also, as people join our groups, how do we empower them to try out the stuff they want to try out, right? It's not always about, there's no right way to do advocacy, right? And so I think it's, how are we letting people come and test out the like things they want to try? And they're like, hey, have we ever tried this? And it may not have been on your agenda, but why not, right? So I think, so that's the other thing that makes this fun, is being able to just say, yeah, let's try the stuff that sounds a little crazy. The Grassroots showed up when we were trying to pass Medicaid expansion in Virginia to this coalition, and they were like, let's do die-ins. And the coalition is just like, this is all nonprofits who've been working on this for like 6 years. And they're like, I guess it won't hurt. So they were just like, go ahead and do some die-ins, right? And then in the end, when I talked to them for my research, I said, they were like, yeah, it wasn't, we had really gotten to the point where we knew the legislation was probably going to get passed anyway. And they're like, but the fact that they did the die-ins actually gave, increased media attention, got people more excited. Like, there was something that we gained from that. Did it make the difference in passing the legislation? No, but did it get people really hyped up and excited about the fact that we were passing it? Yes, and that was important, right? And so I think that's the other thing, is just being open to these different opportunities that might sound crazy, but are sometimes the first way to get people really involved.
Yeah, and I'd like to just thank you, because I think the one way our group really benefited this year was when all of a sudden, when there was this opportunity to replace the head of the Privileges and Elections Committee. And I had said, because I knew you were doing all these sponsored sign-on letters. And I said, do you think we could do this? And it was amazingly easy because of the coalition. We got 35 people to sign it within a week. It was amazing. So we sent it to, you know, to the head of the Senate and the head and to the speaker. And then in another one, just in terms of supporting an amendment to overturn Citizens United, we got 50 groups to sign it. And the scope of the geographic scope of the group of the coalition seems to be broadening. I mean, what are you looking at in terms of, it used to just be Nova. Now is it going to be statewide, and what are you looking at in terms of and another issue, since election issues went so well, guns went well. I think that all the discussions that we had in the Grassroots Coalition was the last couple of years of legislation was really great, except for maybe climate change and campaign finance. But what are you looking at for in terms of issue groups that are coming up?
Yeah, so, well, in terms of expanding the coalition, I mean, I wish we could do this more. To be honest, a lot of the way we've expanded is one through just having the opportunity for people to do those sign-on letters, and then they become aware that we have a progressive platform, and then wanting to sort of be part of that. I will also note that Network Nova, before COVID, was doing a great job setting up lunches in different parts of the state and just inviting whatever groups they could find there to say, hey, like, do you want to join? Do you want to join us? We'd love to hear what's going on in your, you know, area. We want to know what matters to you. So I think that was really helpful. It was another way that it, you know, made a difference. And then I would get in a car with people and just drive to other people's meetings, right? I went with Mary and Burke down to like Richmond once just to go to a Black Voters Matter meeting. And it was because they had just started in Virginia, and we wanted to make sure that there was some support there, and wanted to see what they were planning to do and see if there was some ways that we could be helpful. So sometimes it's just, you know, showing up in other areas and starting to make those connections. I know that American Promise, I mean, you guys, are you a C3?
Not yet.
Not exactly.
No, and that's another question
That's something we've been working on considering. Yes.
Yeah. So
yeah, I was actually, sorry, I'll let you finish, Luisa, and then I'll.
Yeah. So in terms of the C3 situation, typically for our group and the coalition members, I usually encourage them not to, because we do electoral work. But if you're planning on not doing electoral work, one of the key reasons to me to have a C3 is that then you could be part of the C3 roundtable, which is run by CVET, right? And it's nice to have a home, right? I don't know how much they pay attention to campaign finance, but there are some groups who I think are C3s and C4s, and they sit both at the C3 table and the C4 table in Virginia. And what that might do is give you sort of that access in a way that you again sort of have this coalition of groups who are trying to set priorities, and that might be a helpful place to be. It is not that much work to stand up a C3. You just have to know, there is going to be annual reporting. My assumption is you're not going to do much fundraising. So if you're not doing much fundraising, your annual reporting is minimal. You're going to be sending in a postcard to the IRS every year that says, like, we still exist, right? They're really not going to care that much about what you're doing. So as long as there's not a lot of money involved, a C3 would probably be the easiest way to go in terms of, trying to set up an entity if you really wanted to. So happy to entertain questions around that or other questions.
So, I mean, you had spoken eloquently earlier about the importance of malleability that you have found just by working with the multitude of organizations that vary across the spectrum of topics. But in your perspective and your experience, given the fact the myriad of organizations and topics that you've dealt with, for something like campaign finance reform and ethics in campaign finance, do you think, and because it is such a general topic and it is very heavily dependent on engagement by the outside, do you think, other than the C3 name, structurally within the organization, since we are not a coalition yet, since it's just this organization, do you think there needs to be more of like a committee structure on the inside of the group, or do you think it should just be everybody working on an issue, one of the either national issue or local issue? And how do you see best to go about organizing within the organization itself or within the group itself?
Yeah, I mean, really good question. I think, what I've seen with other groups, they've gone both ways, right? You've got sort of like Herndon, Reston, Indivisible is highly organized into these working groups that are issue based, and they do a fantastic job. And I think, but they also have the numbers, enough people to populate something like that. What I've seen, like with the coalition that's worked is, we just have working groups or little teams based on who wants to do something, right? Or someone identifies an issue that we really want to, tackle, and we get someone to like help lead it, right? So like the most recent thing that we've been talking about is, should we primary senators who are getting in our way of getting climate change and campaign finance reform bills passed? And if we do, what does that look like, right? So sometimes it's kind of okay to just go with where the energy is in the group and, allow people to say, look, this is what I'm interested in taking on this year. And then holding them accountable, right? So then when you have group meetings, I want, give me an update. Where are we on this? Do you need help from other people in the group? Things like that. The other thing that we did in the coalition early on was we tried to identify some more formalized sort of, we call them ambassadors. So the people who were going to go to other groups' meetings and sit in and hear what they were talking about, so that we could be informed, about what was going on. And I think that was also quite helpful, right? So it didn't mean Nancy had to be the one who went to all of these meetings, right? But who's going to take on different groups, right? Like Kathleen Murray is our sort of liaison to the gun groups, or the gun safety reform groups, right?
Yeah.
And that's very helpful, so that we don't have to be the ones who know everything that's going on in that space, but we know who to go to, right? And then when we do criminal justice reform, I have some key people who I know I can go to, who will tell me what the priorities, are in the space, because it's not really, we don't have people who are experts in our group on that. So I think there are ways to structure it that don't have to be super formal, but enough so that, people are signing up to like contribute in a particular way. And often early on, it's nice if you just let them decide what that contribution is, but again, to have some accountability around it.
One interesting thing that when I had a call with Sharon, and you mentioned that she's done such a phenomenal job with on climate change, and it was interesting because she said she made these links with a group that actually is a formal lobbying group. I don't know if she talked to you about it, but it seems like, as a grassroots organization, we're building awareness around the issue, but we don't really have an effective lobbying position. And it seemed like that was a good practice in terms of identifying a group that actually has people. And I think they lobby on different issues. So do you have more information on how do you build those linkages with actually people who are actually engaged in lobbying on issues?
Yeah, I mean, so it depends who she was talking about. So there are a couple of ways to do this, right? So for example, in my PhD research, I looked at coalitions, and I was looking at domestic violence coalitions. Pretty much every coalition doing domestic violence work at least has a part-time lobbyist on their payroll, because you need someone in the legislature all the time watching the legislation, because especially in Virginia, as you know, things move so freaking quickly that you need people there who are just like, that's what they're doing full time. So sometimes if you're looking, as you find other C3s or C4s, probably more like C4s, they may have lobbyists on their staff. And so then what I would do is see, like, how can we partner? How can we be supportive? How do we work together? Knowing that they have that access, that can be really helpful. Sharon also, like, if it's the other person I'm thinking about, she literally just ran into this person, and someone introduced them to her when we were on the Hill in Richmond doing a press conference. And so it was just serendipitous that she ran into this guy. But it is helpful. And so I think that's the other place where you could say, look, are there coalitions or groups out there who do have lobbyists, and usually lobbyists know lobbyists. So can you sit down with them and say, look, you know, especially with climate, Nancy, it's not like it doesn't overlap with campaign finance, as we know. So I think you could easily say, hey, I would love to hear, you know, sit down and just learn a little bit more. And who do you know? Or is there anybody lobbying specifically on campaign finance? And if not, then I think it could be one of those things where it's, how do you educate the lobbyist to say, look, when you're talking about climate issues, these are all of the times that it's really linked to campaign finance issues.
Right.
And are there ways that we could work together, or, you know, things like that. So that's what I would do. I would sort of start from there, but definitely as you're meeting new groups, ask them, like, do you have a lobbyist on board? I mean, that would be something, if at some point the coalition became more formalized, that would probably be one of the first people we try to hire as a lobbyist, right? So that we had someone down in Richmond. The other person to talk to, Nancy, is Francesca, who, I don't know if you've met her. She was part of the coalition, then she went to grad school, and now she's down in Richmond. She's like in her 50s. She used to do environmental stuff for the government, feds, and she lives in Richmond full time, isn't necessarily a lobbyist, but she's down there. And I think that, like, she would also be someone to talk to say, hey, like, once we get back up and running and stuff like that, you don't have to be formally, you know, taught how to lobby. You just have to be there and be willing to do it and have the messaging. And a lot of it, as you know, is building relationships, which you did so well with spending those times with the legislators over the past year, really trying to sit down with them. You just need someone who's willing to keep up that work, right?
Yeah, and there were a couple comments from Josh Stanfield. He mentioned like Clean Virginia, Sierra Club. Many of the nonprofits have registered lobbyists. Yeah, it's hard with Clean Virginia. Sort of, they're like the big, you know, Dominion's giving $2 million. Clean Virginia's giving $2 million. It's sort of anyway. And then Jeff says HRISE, the environmental science subgroup of HRI. What is HRI?
Herndon, Reston, Indivisible.
Oh, Herndon, Reston, Individual. That's right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it's, I mean, we've been reaching out, and at one point we were saying, okay, I'm willing to come and give a presentation to your group. You know, is there anybody who might be a liaison between our two groups? I must say, it's a heavy slog.
Yeah, I think the other
Everybody's so
difference
busy.
though is, you know, and this is where the sort of the ambassador part comes in, which is Nancy, you're leading with your message. You're not asking to hear their goals and what they're trying to achieve first. And so sometimes it's like, just with anything, we need to figure out how we're aligning our collective goals. And so usually the first conversation could be or should be, what are your goals, right? What are you trying to achieve? And then hopefully they ask you the same question back, right? Or you go to a couple of their meetings and you start to hear what they're saying. And then you can say, hey, look, you know, you just brought this thing up. Well, that's the reason you're not able to get movement on that is because, you know, these people are taking money from XYZ corporation, right? And so sometimes it's helping, I mean, it's how are we framing it in their perspective and their language, not our own. And I think that's where it also gets hard because, you know, it's great that you have the national organization, but just having someone give you like templates and research and things, that doesn't mean that that's what you necessarily lead with, right? And so it's just hard. It's like any of this work, when you talk to people who do advocacy work, it is long, it is arduous, it is long-term relationship building. So like New Virginia Majority, who I love, does really good work in Virginia, and they've been working on restoring felons' rights to, or former felons' rights to vote. And they've been working on it for 14 years, right? They finally got the legislation passed for a constitutional amendment, which will have to be passed again next year, which will then have to be ratified by the voters. So by the time they finish this is going to be more than a 15-year advocacy campaign, right? I think part of understanding the work that we're doing is sometimes the steps that you're putting in are not, you may not see the end, right? And but it's our job is to, how are we building the movement so more and more people are involved and more people understand why change needs to occur. And it's really hard to realize that you might not be the one who gets to like see that legislation passed.
Yeah.
But that's what movement building is, and that's what advocacy work is it's this belief that you start it and other people will come in and help, behind you, right? That's the whole story of the ERA,
Yeah.
for example. And so some of it is just really, laying the groundwork and being okay with like not seeing huge progress or what we consider progress early on. But the more that you're building relationships with people and the more that they're talking about your issue, that's progress, right?
Josh has his hand up. I see a little hand up there.
Yeah, hey, Luisa, I was really excited to hear that you did your doctoral work on nonprofits, because I have a couple of questions that are, I mean, they're theoretical, but they've been playing out on the ground in Virginia pretty apparently. But I'm wondering two things. One, with organizations that end up formalizing and attempting to raise money, is it possible to avoid the pitfall whereby the development department and the necessity of raising funds, is prioritized above the original mission of the organization? And you see this with all kinds of groups, where satisfying the institutional donors becomes more important for the nonprofit than the mission, because of course they couldn't exist without the money, and that would hurt the mission more than whatever they have to do to get the money. So is that a sort of necessary component of nonprofit in organizational structures in America, or can that be somehow avoided? And the second question is, one thing I've noticed is in progressive groups and organizations in Virginia post 2016 is that you have many individuals who are very critical of the pre-existing organizational structures of the Democratic Party in Virginia and all of the various features you find, including, all the behind the scenes stuff and jockeying for various party positions and et cetera. Is it, how do progressive groups operate internally such that they don't fall into the same kind of pitfalls, the same kind of a small group of people end up making all the decisions for the group? There's, no polling of membership on major decision making. Is there a way to democratize internal structures of these groups and organizations and nonprofits so that they don't repeat the same kind of undemocratic features that our party has in Virginia right now?
Wow, Josh, fantastic questions. I'll do my best. So in terms of nonprofits and mission, so there are two things that, if we gave your group as an example, and you decided to become a 501c3, one way that you can find, you can avoid getting too directed by fundraising is by not having a huge paid staff, right? The more staff you have, the more overhead you have, the more fundraising you have to do. And so the more that you rely on a really well mobilized volunteer base, where then you use your funding in, much more focused ways to either boost your advocacy capabilities or to do some important, marketing work around your issues, that can be really helpful, right? So there's, research shows that if you have a really well managed volunteer base, you need a whole lot less money to run an organization. So I would just encourage, like, don't leave your volunteer roots behind too far. And, but the other place that this is shown to be, I think, not necessarily the case in terms of the mission creep or the like fundraisers influence, is organizations that say that their job is organizing, right? If you are fundamentally a nonprofit that says, I am out in the community and I do community organizing, and you really follow that model of how you mobilize people, the people will be driving the your strategy, because that's how it works. That is how it's structured, is that you don't choose what the strategy, what the priorities are, the people in the community do, right? And so that is the other way to think about this, is how are you structuring the work of your organization much more along the lines of, you know, how community organizers do it rather than how quote unquote formalized nonprofit staff do it. I think that would help as well. And funders at this point, especially with all of the, you know, everything that's happened over the last year, a lot of them want to be funding people who are really rooted in community. And so the question is, well, what does that mean? How are we rooted in community, and how are we taking our lead from community, not taking our lead from professional nonprofit staff who, you know, are not necessarily, you know, the ones who are on the ground, who are part of the communities that are suffering from whatever the issues are that we care about. So that's one. So those are a couple of things. And then in terms of just how do you avoid becoming horribly hierarchical or not really having sort of a democratic process, that really just goes back to, like, I think formalizing the potentially informality of your process, right? So it's, how do we make sure that people know what process we're using, and when it is that they do have the opportunity to give their input, right? And so, like, for example, at the coalition, I try to, at minimum every year, reflect back to everyone and say, look, this is the process we've been using. We haven't really formalized it, but this is how things have been going. Are you guys okay with that? Do people feel like they've been able to, you know, have a voice, be heard? Is there something we need to change? And, you know, and then every time we create a working group, or we, you know, try to bring people together to do X, Y, or Z, we just say it's open to anyone, right? Who wants to be part of the process? I think the biggest challenge is this balance between, you know, keeping it open to everyone, but then at the same time saying, but you don't get to have a say if you're not willing to put in any work, right? Because they're definitely the people who are like, I'd love to, like, have my opinion on X, Y, and Z, but I'm not going to show up. I'm not going to, like, carry the load. I'm going to just, like, have my opinion at the end and then just be difficult. So we've had to find a way to balance that out where, you know, if you are there and you can show up to the meetings, everybody gets a say and everyone has, you know, can contribute. But at some point, it's not fair to say we all did the work, but now all of a sudden someone from somewhere else is coming in and criticizing, or you know, or saying that this isn't the right direction. So there is that piece to consider.
Zena, do you have a question? Or somebody else?
Yeah, I was actually going to see if anybody in the room has a question, because I think we got so much valuable information on such a wide array of topics.
Jeff had a question about asking Luisa to talk a bit more about the advantages of setting up a C4.
Okay, she mentioned that. I mean, we have had, and John Boyer, we organized a meeting with a lawyer to talk about, you know, what are the advantages? I guess, yeah, you mentioned a couple advantages. One journalist we met with really recommended, he said we'd have much more credibility, but I don't know. I mean,
No, Nancy, I think the question is C4 versus C3.
Oh, a C4 versus a C3. Yeah, that's a,
So,
I guess, yeah.
I'm happy to address that. I think, you know, in terms of the credibility thing, I don't think that matters. To be honest, I think what matters more is that they're hearing from their constituents, right? Or people who have, you know, direct relationships with people who are voting for them. I mean, if we were doing federal stuff, that might be different, but at the state level, I just don't think it's that critical. A C3 and C4, the biggest difference is how much lobbying you're allowed to do. To be honest, we don't spend that much money on lobbying, right? And so probably you could go either way. That being said, you know, I think it's more about access to others who do the work, right? So if you are a C4, there's the C4 roundtable that does a lot of work both during the legislative session, but also during elections, right? They really care about this balance. And this is something that New Virginia Majority talks a lot about, which I think is really fascinating, is they started out as a C3 that wanted to advance you know, issues that matter to the immigrant community and working community in Virginia. They found out early on when they went to talk to these communities to say, hey, what issues matter to you and how can we work together to advance these issues? And, people were like, why does it matter? We don't have any power, right? And it just became so obvious in Virginia, which we also saw, right? As the coalition was like, if we don't have the right people in office, it doesn't matter how much we advocate. It doesn't matter how much we lobby. If the right people aren't in those seats, we aren't going to get these issues passed regardless, right? And so New Virginia Majority was like, we can't just do typical advocacy work. It's not enough, right? Yeah. And they started a C4, and they are part of the, they sit at the partners table. I think it was because Tram was running the C4 table at that point. But they are absolutely involved in legislation or in the electoral cycle. That being said, they're not, I don't think they're endorsing candidates because you can't as a C4, but they are working on, voter education. They're working on getting people involved in elections. And so I think that's the other question is, is there at some point some piece of this work that has to be electoral, right? You have, people taking pledges, but, it's hard not to work during the election cycle when it's very obvious that campaign finance reform or that campaign finance is an issue, right? That's the best time to be highlighting, hey, you're running for office. Oh, and how much of that money that you're spending came from corporations? Yeah. So anyway, but whether you do that or you partner with other organizations who have a different entity status and they do that, thinking about that as being an important piece possibly of the longer term goals of, where you might need to go to be able to ultimately see the change happen.
Thank you, Luisa. I actually have one clarified question. When you said you cannot endorse as a C4, you cannot endorse as a C4 or C3?
Yeah, you cannot endorse candidates. That's called electioneering. You can only do electioneering if you're a PAC.
Okay. And then I just have a really quick question. How can an organization like ours and those who are part of your coalition utilize their presence in a massive coalition or like an incredible coalition like yours and others to further the campaigns that they're working on, to sort of build that relationship where the issues that we are working on are collectively advocated for on multiple different fronts without us having to sort of micromanage the details? I mean, I guess we have to, but do you know what I mean? It's just how to utilize the equipment, the grassroots coalitions that we have around us to further our goal. Please.
Yeah, so I think it's just figuring out, each coalition kind of goes about their work in different ways, right? And so figuring out, so like with ours, we have our legislative priorities letter and our press conference that we do during the legislative session. We haven't done as much in terms of pressuring candidates, except for the scorecard or the questionnaire we just sent out asking them their positions on specific things. So I think it's like figuring out what are the tools that other groups have and how do you just make sure that the questions you care about show up there, or the bills you care about show up there. And then when possible, things that I would consider doing, and maybe you do this after the primaries because the primaries are about to come up, but it's, how do you get candidates to talk specifically about these issues that you want to see advanced, right? Like, what are they going to do? And I know we had questions about it, when we did the debates with them, but it's not just, it's like, how do we ask them and how do we remind them and how do we get them to sign pledges up until the election? And then post-election, how are we like the first people in the room that says, hey, so how are we going to operationalize this? Now that you said you were going to do this and now you have the seat, let's put something down and let's make a plan, right? And then in terms of the candidates, what we try to do is we just try to support their campaigns in whatever way we can. Sometimes that might be around messaging related to our issues, but a lot of times it's just like, how do we hold a fundraiser for them so they know that we want, and it could even be a fundraiser related to your issue and say, hey, come and hear about this, but it's a fundraiser, right? It still is helping them. So they see us as we're willing to step up to the plate to make sure that, it's an even thing, we're helping them. And also we're helping them get money from individual donors who are not corporations, right? In a good way.
It's 5:30. I just want to thank Louisa. I think it's just, this has really been a great discussion.
Very helpful, very helpful.
Yeah, and I think John and everybody would agree that our group is doing pretty well in terms of we're having meetings with legislators. You know, before the General Assembly met with 40, we just met with Carrie Coyner, a Republican, last week. And so we're really trying to engage with legislators. But the challenge is growing the grassroots and making the links with these other groups across the state. And I think some of the key points that you made were really important in terms of listening and not talking and understanding what their priorities and configuring our messages to support them. And it's
Lisa, Nancy, may I just ask one more question? Because I did Catherine, you brought up a good point. And I just want to get a clarification, as I was said, can any LLC, a limited liability, be a PAC, or is there other steps that they have to do?
Yeah, good question. I have not gone through the process of what it takes to become a PAC, but some of our coalition members are. So like Virginia Democracy Forward, VADF, they are a state PAC. So you could easily contact Chris or Lori or Luke and ask them what it took to become a state PAC. That would probably be because they did it recently, so they can walk you through it. Usually, with any of these, you first become a corporate entity by incorporating, and then usually all of these things are then the next step, right? Then it's like, okay, you're a corporate entity, you have entity status with a state, but then you go to you basically need to convince the IRS how you should be considered for tax purposes. And that's when you become either a C3 or a C4 or a PAC or those things, right? But I would contact VADF. Yeah.
Okay.
Josh, you have your hand up again?
Yeah, I was just, we got to be really careful when we say PAC because, the Virginia state PACs are very different than the federal PAC. So like with Activate Virginia, at the end of 2016, when we started that, we made a nonprofit, which is essentially like a 527 group for independent expenditures, and then set up the Virginia PAC just as an associated entity, which took, I don't know, like 1 day and almost no money. Basically, all you have to do is have a Virginia bank account and, a principal, someone who will be responsible for the filings. You don't have to have a formal business entity to connect it to. So yeah, any corporation, any LLC, anyone could start a state PAC and have, whoever, whatever individual wants to be the name on it, who's connected to that company. And then the company is the primary funder of the PAC. I mean, think about Clean Virginia on the PAC side. That's the same idea. I mean, Bills is just funding it, right? So for state PACs in Virginia, it's very easy to set them up. There's as we know, right, there's no auditing, there's no compliance. You just set it up and do your filings and you won't get fined as long as you do your filings. But, federal PACs are different, as you'd imagine, right? There's a lot of different rules. You can't coordinate in the same way. It gets really complicated. But, on the Virginia side, it's very simple, very quick. I've done it a few times. It's pretty easy.
Yeah, and I would recommend, as Josh said, state PAC, not federal PAC. But, take advantage of the fact that we have great laws in Virginia that let you do whatever the heck you want. So there is that catch-22 a bit.
Yeah, I just wanted, Catherine put something in the chat. And Catherine, could you tell us how you guys are incorporated? Is she there?
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I'm here, but I'm
started out
out
as a
walking.
C-
If Sarah is on, she is the LLC owner of that. And I have my own LLC, Badass Strategies. But when we got started in this work for what we're doing is Network Nova and then the Women's Summit, we just ran it more like a business, and it's a lot easier bookkeeping. We met with a lawyer. We went through it a couple of times, around the clock, like you're talking, Nancy. Totally feel for you. And in the end, since we were just like, well, let's just stay as a business. It's easier to report. We can do what we want, basically. I mean, you have to keep the books and all that, but it's definitely a lot easier than anytime you get into a C3, it's a nonprofit or a C4. They're easy to incorporate, but you really have definitely the bookkeeping and the management that is really super, I think, more serious. And I think, like Josh said, making that pack is kind of a great option when you have like maybe Network Nova could do that. But Stair would know. I don't know if she's on.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think you made a good point, Catherine, in your chat. You said it depends on what your group plans to do.
Exactly.
I
Exactly.
think that's where we're struggling to.
Right.
Yeah, we don't give money to candidates. We just run, you know, when we do those events, it brought this coalition together that we felt like that helped build things. That really was helpful. And then people can, you know, give us money to help us do our work. So that worked out real well for us right now.
Okay, everybody. Well, Luisa, I really want to thank you. You've always been a champion for all of us. I mean, in terms of the Grassroots Coalition and support
Absolutely.
campaign finance. So.
Really admire the work you do. Right.
Oh, well, thank you guys, and always happy to chat about this because I love it, and that's why I spend all my free time doing it. So,
Thanks for your time. We really appreciate it. We appreciate it.
absolutely.
Yeah.